Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion and the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast series of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcast fix, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family about our podcast. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the few religions founded in the United States, coming into existence during the 19th century's Second Great Awakening. Today, it has just over 1 million members in the United States and upwards of 22 million members worldwide. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the fastest-growing Christian denominations in the world. On today's episode, we will explore the history of this homegrown American church, what its beliefs are, what roles it has played in the unfolding of the American project, and what roles it plays today on America's dynamic religious landscape. To help us do this, we invited Dr. David Trim, Director of the Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, based in Silver Spring, Maryland. Born to missionary parents in Bombay, India, David was raised in Sydney, Australia, and educated in the United Kingdom. He has a BA from Newbold College and a PhD from King's College London, University of London. For 10 years, David taught undergraduate courses in history and graduate courses in missiology at his alma mater, Newbold College in England, and then for 2 years held the Walter C. Utt Chair of History at Pacific Union College in California. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 18 books and has additionally published 80 scholarly articles and book chapters. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and is an adjunct professor of church history at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary. David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Chris, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let's dive in. While our listeners probably have heard of Seventh-day Adventists, many probably don't know its origin story, which is connected to the Millerites and a prophecy when Jesus would return in the early to mid-19th century. Can you share the origins with us?
Yes, so it emerges out of the Millerite movement, which is named after William Miller, a Vermont farmer who studied the Bible intensively in the 1820s and concluded that the passage in Daniel that says, unto 2,300 days shall the sanctuary be cleansed, meant 2,300 years, and that the cleansing of the sanctuary referred to was actually the destruction of the earth and its cleansing, if that's the word, by fire at the second coming. So basing on the prophecy of Daniel, when its start point was, and adding 2,300 years, he worked out that Christ would come, he said, in around 1843 or 1844. And he began sharing this, and soon it took off like wildfire. There were probably hundreds of thousands of adherents, though not all of them were subscribed to a specific date, but all of them believed that Christ's return was literal, which was going against the trend of academic and establishment theology in the 1830s and 1840s, which believed that references to Christ's second coming in the millennium referred to the triumph of Christian values, the triumph of a Christian society around the world. So Miller and his followers said, no, Christ's return is literal and it will be premillennial instead of after the millennium, and also that it was coming very soon. In 1843, Christ didn't come, and some of Miller, it's called the Millerites, but Miller was not an autocratic figure. He really lost control of the movement as it began to spread It was really a highly autonomous and individualistic movement, not seeking to found a new church, but a movement of calling out people within existing denominations. And one of his followers did a new study of the Bible and said Christ is going to come on October 22, 1844. Miller had never said a precise date, but he accepted this, and many of the Millerites preached very urgently that Christ was going to come on October 22, 1844. Obviously, that didn't happen, Chris, and that became known as the Great Disappointment for obvious reasons. And then you have different groups who react in different ways. And so there's an ex-Millerite mainstream that says, yes, Christ will come soon. We got the date wrong, but the event right, and Christ is going to come soon. But unfortunately, they kept splitting. And so the ex-Millerite mainstream soon divided. There was another group, Seventh-day Adventists, who said, no, we got the date right, but we got the event wrong. It's not Christ's second coming. And they proceeded to eventually to start witnessing to others, and eventually they spread overseas and grew today into a worldwide church.
Okay, so when you say they had hundreds of thousands of adherents, that was pre-1843? They had grown that large pre that first date?
Nobody really knows, but historians, I think, generally agree there were probably hundreds of thousands of followers of Miller in the northeast of the United States. They had almost no presence in the South. There were Millerites in the South, and there indeed were black Millerites. That's one of the exciting findings of very recent scholarship. But on the whole, the movement was in the mid-Atlantic states and New England, and especially New England. But there do seem to have been very large numbers involved. Whereas the Seventh-day Adventists who emerged out of them were initially numbered only in the hundreds.
Okay, so the Seventh-day Adventists came out of the splintering of the Millerite movement. Is that
exactly?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And what year was that church formed?
So they gradually emerge and cohere, starting around 1848, and then by the 1850s they've got their own movement with an informal kind of organization. And one of the things that they argue about is whether they need to have an organized church. For various reasons, some of them are very allergic to the idea of formal organization above the congregational level. But eventually they conclude that for the purposes of mission, they need to unite and do so formally. And they do that in May of 1863.
Okay. And is the Seventh-day Adventist Church the only sort of existing church from the Millerites?
There's a movement there's a denomination called the Advent Christians, which still exists. There are probably offshoots of offshoots that you could also trace their lineage back. Some would argue that the Jehovah's Witnesses can be traced back to the Millerites, though Charles Taze Russell himself was not a Millerite, but he may have been influenced by Millerites. But really, I think it's Advent Christians and Seventh-day Adventists are the only denominations that have emerged directly out of Millerism.
Okay, and last question with the origins. What did the other churches in the areas generally think of the Millerites, and especially this prophecy or this idea that Christ would come on a particular date or a specific year? Is the historical record clear on what other denominations thought of this?
Yes, very much so. There was a lot of opposition. Again, saying that Christ's return was literal went against the trend of establishment theology at the time. They were mocked as being deluded, as being ignorant, as being simple. Many of them were actually disfellowshipped by their denominations. And this is one reason why ex-Millerites in the 1850s were opposed to organization, because they said the problem is that organized churches have creeds and they use that as a basis for disfellowshipping, and we want to have no creed but the Bible, which, as you will know, Chris, was also the mantra of the restorationist movements of the Second Great Awakening, the Campbell Stone movements and so forth. So that was a common idea, we'll have no creed but the Bible. But organized denominations generally reacted quite badly to Miller and his followers.
Okay. Thank you. Very helpful. Can you give our listeners a short tutorial relatedly here on Seventh-day Adventist beliefs?
Yes, so Seventh-day Adventists are Orthodox Christians in that they subscribe to all the main points of Christianity. Unlike some, Adventists used to be called one of the great cults. I think that those days have passed, Chris. I think Seventh-day Adventists are now generally accepted as being Christians. But compared with some of the organizations or movements that have been called cults, Adventists are not anti-Trinitarian, for example. We're Orthodox Christian when it comes to doctrine, but we have some beliefs that are unusual and distinctive. One is we continue to believe that Christ's coming will be an actual event, will be witnessed by all the world, and will initiate the millennium described in Revelation chapter 20, as opposed to being after the millennium, which makes us different from a lot of American Protestant churches that do believe in a literal second coming. We believe the name is the clue, seventh day. We believe that the seventh day, Saturday, is God's Sabbath, not Sunday, and that the obligation to keep it is eternal. It's still with us. It didn't pass away with Christ's resurrection. We believe that Christ ministers in the heavenly sanctuary. The sanctuary, of course, is described in the book of Hebrews, and we believe that Christ ministers there, mediating to us the benefits of his death on the cross. We believe immortality is conditional, that the dead effectively, as it were, sleep until the second coming, when the righteous will be given eternal life, whereas the unrighteous, rather than being eternally tormented in hell, will be immediately annihilated at the last judgment that will follow the end of the millennium. So we don't believe in hell. We do believe in a final judgment and in heaven. We also believe that just before those final events, there will be a great apostasy from Christian belief, and that a small remnant, using biblical language, of faithful believers will bear witness to God's law and to the divine character and call Christians back to divine truth. What we call the third angel's message, which derives from Revelation chapter 14, which graphically describes three angels with messages. And we finally believe that the remnant church will be marked by prophecy. And so Adventists in our early years had a prophet, a woman called Ellen G. White. There has been no prophet since her death in 1915. So those are the beliefs that sort of mark Seventh-day Adventists out as distinctive from other Protestants.
Okay, and was this prophet, it doesn't sound like she was, or maybe she was there at the organization of the church?
Yes, she was. So she was a Millerite. She was only 16 at the time of the Great Disappointment. But she is very active in the discussions amongst the various groups who eventually cohere into Seventh-day Sabbath-keeping Adventists, and who eventually adopt the name Seventh-day Adventist and then formally organize a church with that name. She is present at that, but she's actually not one of the delegates at that founding of the church in 1863, but she was there.
Okay. And was there a leader at that founding?
Yes.
President or a priest, or however they term it? Was there an individual that led the movement?
Yes, the real leaders of the early movement were an elderly man, a respected Millerite leader called Joseph Bates, and a young firebrand Christian Connection preacher, James White, who married Ellen White. James White was then really took over from Joseph Bates and became very much the leader of the nascent embryonic Seventh-day Adventists. But he was aware that because he was married to the prophet, some might feel he had a conflict of interest. So when the church was organized, he actually declined to be elected president. He was elected president and refused to serve. And so instead they elected a sort of elder statesman, somebody who everybody admired and respected. But then later James White did become General Conference president and served 3 separate terms in that office, holding it for a number of years. So James White is really the titanic figure of early Seventh-day Adventism, without which the church wouldn't have come into existence, I would say.
And his wife was the prophet.
Yes, that's right.
And what sort of, well, maybe this will come up in the next question. Can you help us understand how the church is organized structurally, locally and centrally, and how that changed, how this has changed throughout history?
Yes. So we have an overarching organization called the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, terminology that will be familiar to Methodists, for example, and some others. Our General Conference, though, is both an actual conference held every 5 years, though originally it was held annually, but as the church has grown and spread around the world, it's become difficult for everyone to get together every year, so we have it every 5 years. So there is an actual conference every 5 years, what we call the General Conference session, but the General Conference is also a permanent overarching organization. When it was founded, it was made up of individual state conferences, so each state or part of a U.S. state became what was called a conference, again borrowing terminology that was familiar to American Protestants at the time. For those listeners who are wondering, a conference is sort of functionally like a diocese in the Roman Catholic or Anglican communion, say. As the church spread, they recognized the need for regional organization, and so in 1901 they organized what were called unions, which were unions of conferences. And so those are the three levels of church organization: the conference, which is local, the union, which is regional, and then the general conference, which is global. Though we also have something that we call divisions of the general conference, which are effectively like a branch office of the general conference headquarters, and they're roughly on each continent, though there's 3 in the African continent and 3 in the Asian continent because of the size and also the number of members. So the conference, as I say, is functionally like a diocese, and a union is something like an archdiocese, again, to give a comparison for listeners. And then the general conference is the overarching global organization.
Okay. And then locally, so if I see a Seventh-day Adventist church, how is that led and how are they connected to these conferences?
So when a local church is organized, it's received into what we call the sisterhood of local churches, and it then becomes a member of the conference. The conference will have a meeting. It depends on their constitution. It can be every 3 years, every 4 years, or every 5 years, at which they elect new officers and departmental directors. And local churches have representation at that. In our system, we are not Congregationalists. The local congregation has a lot of autonomy, but the church building itself is owned by the conference, and the pastor who is responsible for the church is employed by the conference. So the conference has a fair amount of authority, though in practice, local churches are pretty autonomous.
Okay. And before we leave structure, I'm fascinated by this woman who is a prophet, no prophets now. What was her role? She wasn't the president at any time. What was her role as prophet, and what is absent now that there is none?
It's a great question. No, she was never president. She counseled presidents and general conference meetings and the church's executive committee, and her counsel was always taken very seriously, and it indeed could be quite chastening at times. She didn't hesitate to rebuke church leaders when they made mistakes, which probably made her a little difficult to live with at times, but church leaders believed she was speaking with God's authority, and so they took it very seriously. She was never president, and she always allows the organization to go to function as it should. But as I say, she writes what she calls testimonies. And her role is partly a spiritual one. She writes many testimonies to individuals, but then also as the church grows to church leaders, indicating where she believed God wanted them to do and also not to do. But she was also a great institution founder. She, in fact, is one of the great institution founders in American religious history, Chris. She founded hospitals, what we call sanitariums, but today are hospitals, and colleges and universities and schools. And she did this not only across North America. She traveled regularly backwards and forwards across North America. As soon as the Transcontinental Railway was built, she regularly went backwards and forwards between the East and West Coast. But she also spent 2 years in Europe and 9 years as a missionary in Australia. So she was responsible for founding organizations and institutions on 3 continents.
Might be worthy of a podcast episode.
Yes.
Sounds like.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, let's move on. So what was the church's position on slavery?
So the church was adamantly abolitionist. And this, in fact, is something that was always known, but new details are coming to light in just very recent scholarship. A recent PhD dissertation by Kevin Burton at Florida State University shows just how radical early Seventh-day Adventists were. Joseph Bates, who I mentioned, was actually signing petitions in the 1840s for the United States to recognize Haiti, which was highly radical at the time because Haiti was a black republic. And so the U.S. did not have diplomatic relations with Haiti until after the American Civil War. He was signing petitions for the end of miscegenation laws, so to allow blacks and whites to marry, which again, even for many abolitionists, was a shibboleth. You couldn't comprehend the idea that blacks and whites could marry. So early Adventists are adamantly abolitionist. The first president, I mentioned that James White was not the first president. The first president, a man called John Byington, operated a station on the Underground Railway, and other early Seventh-day Adventists also were involved with the Underground Railway. And Ellen White, as a prophet, actually writes that it is the duty of Adventists to break the law when it comes to the Fugitive Slave Act. So she actually, it's, I think, the only time she positively encourages law breaking, but for her, this is such an appalling and immoral piece of legislation that Adventists should actively break it. And for Adventists who have this apocalyptic mindset, Chris, for them, they believe that eventually the United States will apostatize and that that's one of the signs of the end. And for them, that the United States can be a slave power is a sign that its alleged Christianity is hypocritical. And so for them, this is a sign of the apostasy of American Christianity. They see it that strongly.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And relatedly, how did the U.S. Civil War affect Seventh-day Adventist Church and its members?
Seventh-day Adventists were very conflicted by the Civil War because they tended to come out of a peace church tradition, and their instinct was not to bear arms, but they perceived the war with the South as being a just war, almost a holy war, which of course they have in common with many people in the North. And so, again, just very recent research shows that a surprisingly large number of Seventh-day Adventists joined the Union Army. Of course, it's a very small movement, only about 3,000 in 1863. But still, we're talking about dozens of men joining the Union Army. But by the end of the war, and so Adventists have a debate among themselves as to what their position should be. But by 1864, they conclude that they should not bear arms, and they actually send a representative to the U.S. military, and they are recognized as being one of the peace churches, like the Quakers. And so that it is that thereafter the church's position is that Seventh-day Adventists will serve in their country's military, but will not bear arms. They will not take life.
Okay. Very good to know. Where did the Seventh-day Adventists locate themselves in the early 20th century fundamentalist modernist schism in American Christianity?
That's a great question. Adventists, again, are conflicted about the fundamentalist modernist schism. Adventists, because of their apocalyptic interpretations and their belief that eventually Protestants will apostatize from their faith in large numbers, tend to be suspicious of any large Protestant movement. So their instinct is not to ally themselves with either side in any conflict in American Protestantism, because for them, the whole system is suspect to a degree.
Okay.
But instinctively, I would say, they lean towards the fundamentalist side, especially because Seventh-day Adventists, because of the belief in the seventh-day Sabbath, are very strong creationists, because the seventh-day Sabbath is instituted at creation. So Seventh-day Adventists can never have any temptation to go along and say, well, actually, there's no temptation to believe in theistic evolution, just the opposite. They very strongly oppose it. And that's one of the things the fundamentalists do, of course. So they have things in common, but Adventists never espouse verbal inerrancy, Chris, and I think that's important to stress. And interestingly, they do that because of the prophet Ellen White, who writes very clearly and plainly that inspiration is what we would call a process of thought inspiration. God puts the thoughts into the minds inspired writers, but does not dictate to them. They're not just secretaries. And so that's a major difference with fundamentalists. And of course, it has implications for how one might interpret the scriptures.
Right. Okay. And for our listeners, verbal inerrancy, what do you mean by that?
So that's believing that the original manuscripts of the Bible, that every word is inspired, and that and that you have to take the meaning very literally, because every word was directly inspired by God, and there are no errors, there are no inconsistencies at all in Scripture.
And the Seventh-day Adventists do not believe in that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very high opinion of Scripture as being inspired, and we would say that any apparent errors probably are due to errors in copying and transmission over the centuries. But we do acknowledge that there are what appear to be some inconsistencies in the Scriptures, and again, we believe that you don't have to take every passage exactly literally, because it's the thought that has been inspired, and then human agents choose the words in which they express it.
Okay, good. Let's move on to World War I and World War II. You touched on Seventh-day Adventists being an official peace church, but how did those wars affect the church? How did the church deal with those two wars?
Those wars were very difficult. The church had started in 1874. The church sent its first missionary abroad, so it's 150 years this year. They sent their first missionary to Switzerland, and soon after they sent more missionaries. And by the end of the 1880s, they've got missionaries in Australia and the African continent. And in the 1890s, they spread to Asia and South America. But where the church grew most dramatically in terms of Adventist mission fields was Germany and the German-speaking lands of Central and Eastern Europe. And actually, in the early 20th century, the church in German-speaking Europe was growing faster than the church in the North American homeland. But the church in Germany, when the First World War came, adopted a position that the church should be the handmaiden of the state. And so not only did German church leaders officially say that it was all right to bear arms, they actually encouraged young men to volunteer. They turned local churches into recruiting stations, and so they are at odds with the tradition. And this is a problem because some German Adventists are aware of what had happened in the Civil War and aware that actually the American church taught that you should abstain from bearing arms, and that if you were in the military, you should try to keep Sabbath, whereas the German church leaders basically say, whatever the state commands you, you should do. So this causes a schism within German Adventism, which is kind of patched over in the 1920s after the war ends. But then comes the 1930s and the Nazis. And unfortunately, Chris, German Adventists don't respond to the Nazis in the way we might wish. Many Seventh-day Adventists are vegetarian. We have a very strong emphasis on healthy living, which is why we have the world's largest Protestant medical system all around the world. We have a very strong emphasis on healthy living. Adventists don't drink alcohol or use tobacco, and those are things that church members can be disciplined for if they're found to do that. So there's a very strong emphasis on health. And of course, Adolf Hitler was vegetarian and teetotal, and it's actually the Nazis introduced the strongest legislation against smoking that any government has. So, and also they're anti-communist. So for German Adventists in the 1930s, they look at Hitler and the Nazis and say, well, there's a lot to sympathize with here. Eventually, the church gets banned, but there'd been another schism amongst those who thought that they should again serve the German state. So the effect of World War I and World War II was to really stop the growth in Germany that had been so dramatic in the first decade of the 20th century. For the church in America, which was still very much the mother church at this time and influenced the rest of the world, World War I posed a problem. Because, of course, by that time, it's 50 years since they'd had the Civil War. American Adventists have forgotten what their position on war was, because The only wars America had fought had been small wars with all volunteer forces. So actually, church leaders have to do research and establish just what was our position established in the 1860s. And they adopt the view that Adventists should serve in the military. If they're conscripted, they should join, but they should refuse to bear arms and they should attempt to keep Sabbath as much as possible. So this is a compromise, and not everybody's happy with it. There were those who believed in just war and said if the government instructs you to fight, you should simply do that without any restriction. And there were those who were truly radical on peace and pacifism and said, no, we shouldn't even serve in the armed forces. But the church came up with this compromise. And in the 30s, as it became apparent that from the world's situation that it was likely there would be another major war, the church actually began training its young men in America in what was called the Medical Cadet Corps. It operated at all the dozen Adventist colleges and universities in the United States. And it trained them in first aid, medical. It basically enabled men to become medics if they joined the army, and also taught them how to drill and get used to being in a military situation. And Adventists adopted the language there, not of conscientious objection, but they preferred the term conscientious cooperator, because they said we're good citizens, we cooperate with the military, but we will not kill, and we try to, as much as possible, to observe Sabbath. So again, this is a compromise that not everybody is happy with, but it became the official church position and remains the official church position. One Seventh-day Adventist of whom some listeners may have heard is Desmond Doss, who served in the U.S. Army on Okinawa, won the Congressional Medal of Honor as a medic, never carried a weapon, and rescued between 50 and 100 men, and was the subject of the major Hollywood film Hacksaw Ridge, which came out a few years ago and was very successful. And it's a true story. He himself was badly wounded, refused to bear arms, and even though wounded himself, rescued between 50 and 100 wounded men, by getting them back off the field of fire and towards the baseline. So Adventists definitely did serve in the military during the war, but they did so as non-combatants.
Wow. I've heard of Hacksaw Ridge, but I didn't know it was based on a Seventh-day Adventist story, so I'll have to watch that.
Yes.
Yeah. So about that time in history, 1945, say how many, what was the church membership like in the United States and worldwide about that time? And where were they located in the United States primarily?
So they were chiefly located on the West Coast and in the South and around the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes and the Washington, D.C. area, and the South, the West Coast, California. California has always been a major part for the church ever since it moved there in the late 1860s. At that stage, there were around 600,000 to 700,000 Seventh-day Adventists worldwide. Of those, 200,000 were in North America. So at that stage, North America still very much dominated, but there were also large bodies of believers in Australasia and Europe. The church was beginning to spread in the Americas, the Inter-American and South American region as well, but in the African area, which were mission fields, it was still quite small. Whereas today, more than 40% of church members are on the continent of Africa, but in the 1940s, the church was still quite small in Africa.
Okay, well, let's jump to missiology a bit, and we'll go back to the civil rights movement. Tell us about the missionary efforts of the church and how it has grown to 22 million worldwide, with just over 1 million here in the United States.
As I say, the church started its missionary effort in 1874, and by the end of the century, it had a presence on every continent. But I would say, other than in Germany, it was sort of a toehold. It didn't have a very strong presence. In 1901, the church underwent a major reorganization, a really radical overhaul of its church structure. It introduced unions, which I referred to earlier, and it reorganized itself to become a missionary church, and that was very much its focus. and indeed the General Conference Executive Committee became a mission board. So that tells you how focused they were on mission. And thereafter, the numbers of missionaries they send out every year increase, and the amount of giving increases. In fact, Chris, in the 1920s and 1930s, Adventists gave to missions per capita more than any other American Protestant denomination.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And that continued into the 1950s. Well, I don't think that's something I've established from my own research. If you look at figures from American Protestant missionary organizations, they give per capita giving for different denominations. They don't include Seventh-day Adventists, but from our statistical reports, you can work out what the giving of North American Adventists was, and they're actually giving more per capita than the supposed largest Protestant denomination. So that tells you how committed North American Adventists were to taking the message right around the world. And they pretty soon get strongholds of believers in Scandinavia, in German-speaking Europe, as I said, in South Africa, in Australia, where Ellen White actually serves for 9 years. And they use these as springboards for mission elsewhere. So, for example, Europe basically says, we will take responsibility for missionizing Africa. America takes on and Australia take on responsibility for Asia. America really takes, and the Germans take on responsibility for the Middle East. And so the church is sending out large numbers of missionaries every year, and it's also giving to mission, and that's fueling the growth of the church around the world. So it's a very mission-focused organization.
Okay, sounds like it. Tell us about the Seventh-day Adventist Church's role in the civil rights movement, mid-20th century America.
Yeah, Chris, this is one of those areas where we wish our predecessors had been other than they were. Unfortunately, Adventists were not as involved in the civil rights movement as really we should have been. If you think how radical we were on race in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s,
yeah,
one would hope for a different response, especially because one of the Little Rock Five, the 5 people whose desire to attend a regular school led to the federal government sending troops into Little Rock under President Eisenhower, one of them was a Seventh-day Adventist.
Oh, wow.
He left the church in adult life, partly because he felt the church didn't support, the civil rights position. And what had happened, Chris, is that Adventists had become very middle class and respectable. They'd well integrated into American society, even though some American Protestants still regarded them as a cult. But because of the emphasis on healthy living and medical care, a significant number of American Adventists were doctors or nurses, which of course meant that they were upwardly mobile. So white Americans had become very well established, very middle class, and didn't want to rock the boat. And you can even find, for example, in Adventist church papers, hyperbolic praise of J. Edgar Hoover as the champion of evangelical Americanism. That's just been the subject of a recent book on J. Edgar Hoover and white Christian nationalism, and Adventists share in this almost idolizing of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI as a bastion against communism and blacks. What helps Adventists is that in the 1940s, they had reorganized the church to have black-only conferences. This isn't what black African-American Adventists wanted. What they wanted was to be properly integrated. But they recognized that wasn't happening, and so they campaigned to have African-American only conferences, which would ensure that African-Americans could advance in positions of church leadership and responsibility. So by the 1960s, that happens in the 1940s. So by the 1960s, there are quite a number of North American conference presidents who are African-American. And in 1966, at that year's General Conference session, a new president was elected who had served as a missionary in India and Africa and was very progressive on race. And after that, the church does start to embrace civil rights, but it's slow to do so, and we have to acknowledge that. But from the late 1960s onwards, Adventists are embracing progressive ideas about race. And today, actually, the president of the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is African American, and you have union presidents as well as conference presidents who are African American. So today, I would say the Adventist Church is a model of racial harmony and respect between different ethnic groups. Today, many of the blacks are not African American; they're from the Caribbean or Africa, and you have many North American Adventists from the Inter and South America and from Asia Pacific. But there's peace and respect between all those different ethnic groups. So we do learn something from our mistakes in the early civil rights era.
Okay. Well, thank you for that honest answer. What about the indigenous peoples? How did the Adventists relate to them?
There's something that I, as a Seventh-day Adventist myself, feel proud of. From the beginning, Adventists ordain local people, indigenous people, as ministers, and the pastor is the sort of primary building block of church organization. So there's no sense in which only missionaries can do ministerial work. It always involves indigenous people from the very beginning, all around the world. And so by the 1930s, for example, in China, you're beginning to have conference presidents and other significant officers who are Chinese themselves. The overall leadership of the church is still in the hands of missionaries, but the church is already experiencing indigenization, to use an ugly word, but an important word. And that's happening around the world. So Adventists are pretty trusting local people to take on responsibility for the mission. And that, Chris, is the reason why the church has grown. It's at the point that there's a successful transition from missionaries to local leaders and local workers that things take off, because, of course, indigenous people know how to reach their own people better than missionaries do. But the church is willing to entrust that mission to local people rather than retaining all the authority in the hands of missionaries.
By the way, I didn't send you this question, but it just came into my mind when you were talking about this. So there's this thing, and some of our listeners will have heard us talk about it before, called the crisis of missions, post-World War II, where different Christian churches looked at their missionary efforts and wondered, well, should we do more social justice work, or should we continue to look at salvation? So that sort of crisis of missions, was that,
yes.
Did the Adventists have that crisis as well, and how did they respond if they did?
We never had that crisis. We were always very clear that salvation came first. But Adventists, Chris, were very well aware of what was going on. I've read a number of missionary memoirs by Adventists from the 30s through to the 50s and 60s, and they themselves often had good relations with other Protestant missionaries of other denominations, because, of course, when you're out there in the non-Christian world, you value what you have in common more than that which divides you. But they write about how other Christian missionaries are undergoing this crisis of belief and, lack of confidence in whether they're doing the right thing. But Adventists never share that. On the other hand, we have to say that Adventists always were involved in what one might term social justice, partly because, not in an indirect way, but it's interesting, and this is research I've done myself, that shows Adventists in Central and South America, for example, actually get labeled communists by local landowners and important people, because they are seen as being on the side of the local people, of indigenous people, of the indigenous peoples against oppressors. And the reason is that for Adventists, if you're going to save somebody, you need to teach them to read so they can study the Bible, and you teach them healthy living. But you also, when you teach them to read, you teach them to write and do mathematics. Education is a big Adventist thing. Again, we have the world's largest parochial Protestant school system around the world. And so when you teach local people to read and write, the devious contracts and instruments that landowners have used to oppress people suddenly become exposed, and people are empowered they can, for example, write petitions, and there's been work done on Adventism in Peru, for example, in the Amazonian region of Peru, that shows petitioning by local people grows dramatically in regions where there are Adventist missionaries. And petitioning the central government is one of the ways that they can overcome oppressive landowners in their local areas. So just because of the Adventist emphasis on salvation and on health, Adventists do things which empower local people to a great extent, and for that reason, Adventists attract the hostility of the entrenched interests, and this happens around the world. So Adventists, in a sense, are always involved with social justice, even though they wouldn't conceptualize it themselves in that way.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Can you give us a sense of the day in the life of an American Seventh-day Adventist, maybe in the 1950s and maybe today? What would a daily life look like regarding his or her religious practices?
Right. So in 1950, probably more than today, but still to some extent today, a North American Adventist household would begin the day with a devotional, with the fact that draws in the whole family, what we call observing the morning watch, which is a term we borrow from wider American Protestants, and some of your older listeners may be familiar with that terminology. It's kind of fallen out of fashion today, but in 1950, I would say the great majority of Adventists would have begun the day by gathering their spouse, their children together, having a reading from the Bible or a reading from a devotional book. The church publishes devotionals with a text and a reflection for the day. For each day throughout the year, we publish one of these books every year. And so it would begin with a Bible reading, a reading from one of these devotional books, and a prayer. For the rest of the day, an Adventist life would look much like any other American person's life, except, of course, there would be grace prayed at every meal. Again, in 1950, more than today, midweek, they would be likely to attend what was called a prayer meeting, it was often on a Wednesday, because that was the middle of the week. People would gather at their local church to pray together, to engage in devotionals together, some Bible reading, but especially to pray for different things together. And then on Saturday, well, before that, on Friday night, the family would have a special worship of Vespers to introduce Sabbath, because Adventists mark the Seventh-day Sabbath in the way that Jews do, because we believe that Jews have the correct understanding of the Bible, which is the day starts at sunset. So for Adventists, the Sabbath starts sunset Friday night and goes through to sunset Saturday. So Friday night, Adventists would, as a family, would gather to usher in the Sabbath, would often do something special. In my family, for example, Friday night dinner was always lit by candles. It's not a religious thing. There's no religious significance to the candles, but it was to make it special and the sense that you're entering a sacred time. Saturday, you would go to what we call Sabbath school, which is like Sunday school, but obviously it's not on Sunday, so you have to rename it. And then Sabbath school would be followed by a church service. In many American churches today, there would then be a lunch afterwards at which people would bring their own food and would have a potluck, but there would be a fellowship meal. In the 1950s, all the way through to the 70s, much less so today, church and lunch would be followed by an afternoon meeting at which somebody would speak. There might be a religious film, or there might be, again, Bible study and group prayer. And then Saturday night, you would mark the closing of the Sabbath at sunset Saturday. So that gives you a sense of the sort of daily and weekly rhythms of a Seventh-day Adventist in North America. Some of those things were more common in the 1950s as American society has itself become less religious. That inevitably has had an effect, and some of those practices are less common now, but all of them would still be followed by some Adventists in America.
Okay, that's a great picture you painted for us. Can you tell us briefly what a church service looks like? What goes on?
Yeah, so Adventists would have a joke amongst ourselves that it's 3 hymns and a prayer.
Okay.
It's very typical to have 3 hymns, though. These days, in North America, especially in some parts of the world, they would use praise music rather than the hymns. There is an Adventist hymn book. In fact, the first Adventist hymn book got printed before the church was organized. James White printed Adventist hymn books in the 1850s, full of songs looking forward to the second coming. In the 20th century, the church has published larger hymn books drawing on the great tradition of Protestant and even Catholic hymnody. So in many parts of the world, they would still use the hymn book, but increasingly in North America and some other parts of the world, they would use praise music. So there you get away from the 3 hymns because, of course, praise music often continues at some length. But you would have a corporate prayer in which an elder or someone prays on behalf of the congregation. An offering would be taken up, and there would be a sermon. And the sermon would typically be of 30 minutes or sometimes longer. Many denominations, of course, a sermon these days would be 10 minutes. Adventists there would be a lot of harumphing and sniffing of noses if a sermon only went for 10 minutes. Even 20 minutes, people would probably be surprised. They might be pleasantly surprised, but 30 minutes is sort of what's expected for the sermon, and it's not uncommon for it to go a little beyond that. And it would typically be a very biblically based sermon.
Okay. And ornamentation, what does the inside of a Seventh-day Adventist church look like?
Adventists don't have a theology about ornamentation, but we have tended to draw from the more rigorous side of Protestantism. So Adventist churches, it's a great question, actually, Chris, and it's not one Adventists themselves even think much about because we take it for granted. There wouldn't be that much adornment of the church. Quite a number of Adventist churches would have stained glass somewhere in the church, but it wouldn't be all stained glass. It would be a feature window with stained glass. There are no crosses. Well, there might be some, but it would be unusual for there to be crosses. Adornment is something, again, we don't have a theological argument against it. It's just our practice and our custom is to be very stripped down, sort of more Calvinist than Lutheran or certainly Catholic.
That's what I was thinking. And last question about the church life and the religious life of a believer. Any sacraments, rituals in the meeting, communion?
Yes, we believe, we don't use the term sacrament. We say there are 2 ordinances, or rather 3. There's baptism and there's communion. But communion, and this is something that is worth mentioning, Adventists from a very early time believed that that what happened at the Last Supper should be completely replicated by Adventists. So Adventists wash feet. Just as Christ washed his disciples' feet and said, you should wash your disciples' feet. So Adventists believe that that's a perpetual command as well as the Lord's Supper. So for us, communion is both the Lord's Supper, the bread and the grape juice. And we would have grape juice rather than wine because we're teetotal. So for us, it would be unfermented grape juice. The bread would be typical, like most churches, a wafer. But also we would have washing of feet, which would be done by men and women separately. That was scandalous in the 1840s because people imagined that Adventists were engaging in cross-gender washing of feet, which of course would have been regarded as appallingly immoral, but actually they're separated by men and women. Okay. So communion is both the Lord's Supper and the washing of feet. And then the other ordinance that the church has is baptism, which is by immersion. We borrowed that from the Baptists. So some of our practices we've borrowed from the Calvinists, from the Methodists, and in this case we borrow baptism from immersion from the Baptists. So that's an important event in the church member's life.
Okay, thank you. Let's move into sort of outward facing to politics. How has the church participated in American politics? How does it do that or not do that?
So in its early days, Adventists were, as I say, abolitionists, and indeed the prophet encouraged lawbreaking when it came to the Fugitive Slave Act. After the Civil War, of course, that's no longer an issue, but Adventists then are very strong temperance campaigners. And in fact, in the late 19th century, Ellen G. White was quite well known outside Seventh-day Adventist circles, but as a temperance advocate. She was one of those great, women temperance advocates who are quite influential in the temperance movement and eventually helped to get prohibition passed. And Ellen White actually says that if there's an election, if there's an election on a Saturday, it was to be held on a Saturday, Adventists should take part to vote for prohibitionist or temperance candidates. Or if there was an initiative on the ballot for temperance, Adventists should vote then. Fortunately, most American elections don't take place on a Saturday, but of course in some parts of the world they do. And so Ellen White actually says it's all right to take part in an election on Saturday to vote for a temperance candidate. So Adventists are involved in politics through to the 1919 amendment to the Constitution that brings in prohibition. They're obviously very disappointed when it gets repealed under Franklin Roosevelt about 12 years later. And thereafter, Adventists are very wary of politics. Our business, as we talked about the crisis of mission, Adventists are very focused on the salvation of souls. And so Adventists are not deeply political, and we're particularly wary of partisan politics. There are Adventists who've become congressmen. The first Adventist became a congressman in the 1970s, a member of the House of Representatives for Southern California. He was a Republican. In the last 10 years, there have been Adventist congressmen who are both Democrat and Republican. At the moment, there are, I think, 2 members of the House of Representatives who are Seventh-day Adventist. Both of them are Democrats, and one is African-American, one is Hispanic. So Adventist politics has probably drifted a little bit to the left simply because of the numbers of African-Americans, Caribbean, and Hispanics who naturally sort of tend to lean a little more Democrat. Historically, Adventists would have been very Republican, Chris, partly because of their abolitionism and partly because of their suspicion of government and their desire, as it were, to be left alone and get about their business. So Adventists tend to be small c conservative around the world, but on particular issues, Adventists are involved in politics. So Adventists have been involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. African-American Adventists were quite involved in protesting, always protesting peacefully, I should emphasize, because we're a nonviolent church. But so there are Adventist pastors and congregations and even church leaders who are quite involved on certain political issues, but we tend to be very skeptical of political parties and the whole partisan structure. And I think there's a feeling that it's very difficult to become a politician without compromising your moral principles, whether you're on the left or the right.
Okay, understood. Last couple of questions. What are some people, or who are some people known to the general public, who are Seventh-day Adventists? Maybe not right now, but historically or now.
Yes.
You know anybody?
Desmond Doss, as I mentioned, the non-combatant who won the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1945. One that I think everyone will have heard of, Little Richard. Little Richard, after he became a pop singer, converted to Seventh-day Adventism and actually took part in evangelistic meetings. He was a very active Seventh-day Adventist. I have a friend who remembers being in a local church, and Little Richard arrived with his entourage because he was in the city that week and he knew it was going to be communion, so he came to the local church and he took communion. So he was a pretty committed Seventh-day Adventist, actually. Take Six, a gospel group that have won a number of Grammy Awards, are Seventh-day Adventists. They actually formed at Oakwood College, now Oakwood University, which is the Adventist historically black college, based in Huntsville, Alabama. So Take Six are a group some of your listeners will be aware of because they've been very successful. Barry Black, Admiral Barry Black, the chaplain of the United States Senate, is a Seventh-day Adventist. He, because we accept military service so long as it's in the non-combatant role, Adventists do serve as chaplains in the United States military and in militaries in other parts of the world. And so Barry Black actually advanced to the rank of admiral, became chief of chaplains for the United States Navy, and went from that to become chaplain of the United States Senate, and has impinged on the wider consciousness on a number of times, including his prayer after the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. So Barry Black's an Adventist, but perhaps the one that most people would have heard of, other than Little Richard, is Ben Carson, who, of course, did seek the Republican presidential nomination in 2016. And Ben Carson, a famous surgeon, the author of a best-selling book and the subject of a couple of TV and film docudramas about his life. So those are some people that who are Seventh-day Adventists.
Okay. And what about any events or pieces of Americana, as I put it, that are known to the public that are connected to the Seventh-day Adventists?
I don't think there are any pieces of Americana that would be known to the public. The thing that many Americans will have encountered is an Adventist hospital. And I myself, when I was an academic and going to conferences and introduced myself, very often people would say, "Oh, I haven't heard of your college because we have small liberal arts colleges, but I have been to an Adventist hospital. One of my family has been to an Adventist hospital." We have many Adventist hospitals in the United States. So that's an area where Adventism, again, would impinge perhaps on the wider consciousness of the American public.
Okay. For some reason, I want to say that Kellogg.
Yes, absolutely. John Harvey Kellogg and his brother Will Keith Kellogg were both Seventh-day Adventists.
Okay.
So actually, breakfast cereal is at Seventh-day Adventism's gift to the world, Chris.
There you go. Okay.
If anyone who has a breakfast cereal in the morning is engaged, there is a piece of Americana, or indeed even beyond America. Breakfast cereal was invented by John Harvey Kellogg, again, because Adventists were vegetarians. So they wanted to, how can you have a healthy breakfast that isn't meat heavy? So he invents toasting grains and doing things with that. Eventually, John Harvey Kellogg goes off the rails. He actually became an advocate of eugenics and all kinds of things in his disfellowship from the church. Will Keith Kellogg, the man who invented cornflakes and the founder of the Kellogg's Corporation, also leaves the church, but they have other brothers, including their oldest brother, who remains Seventh-day Adventist throughout their life, and their older brother, Merritt Kellogg, founds an Adventist hospital in California and helps to found one in Australia. So the Kelloggs, some of them leave the Adventist church, but others remain. But breakfast cereal, yes, that's our gift to the world.
Okay. Well, that's a great almost last answer to the last question, but one more. As we conclude, do you want to share, David, any lessons or takeaways from the general topic of Seventh-day Adventists in the American story, either in terms of important historical transformations you chart or in terms of helping our listeners better understand today's present moment in the American narrative? Sort of a heady question.
Yes. I do think Adventists illustrate the tendency of radical movements to want to become respectable. It isn't true for everyone. The Mennonites and the Quakers have remained, as it were, on the, in some respects, the fringes of Christianity, acting as calling out to Christianity's conscience. Seventh-day Adventists began there, and many Seventh-day Adventists would still be there, but there was a tendency for Seventh-day Adventists to professionalize, to become middle class, to become well-established, to seek respectability, as opposed to being a reform movement within American Christianity. Things like the Seventh-day Sabbath and vegetarianism and some of our other beliefs continue to mark us out, and so we continue by our religio-cultural practices, if I can term it that way, to be distinctive. We do the way we live our lives, that weekly rhythm sets us apart from other Christians. But that tendency of even radical movements to become mainstream, which you very much see in American religious history. Even Christianity Today, which was, once the evangelical paper, is now adopting positions that would have been associated, at least in the past, with the mainline churches. That trend, I think you do see it in Seventh-day Adventist history as well. And indeed, Adventists are conscious of that and would ourselves see the need to go back to our original calling, if I can put it that way, as a reform movement within Christianity, even while we do embrace our identity as Protestants.
Okay, well, you have the last word. Thank you. We have been talking with David Trim, Director of the Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please write a review. David, thank you so much for being with us and helping us comprehend the American project better by understanding the Seventh-day Adventist Church, its history, how it has participated in the American project, and where it sits on the American landscape today. It was informative and enlightening, and I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Very much so. Thank you, Chris.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.